You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Thursday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Go check it out. All the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. And then come on over to my live YouTube stream, which is a simulcast of this broadcast in video. And you can join the Intrepids over in the lively chat room over there. And that's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. So, before I get going, as most of you know by now, President Donald Trump was impeached last night by the House of Representatives. And I think it's a couple of things that are, first of all, very telling underneath the mix, is that we knew this was coming, first of all. Why? Because you have a House of Representatives that's dominated by the party that wanted him out. And remember, this impeachment proceeding was the 9th such impeachment proposal, if you can call it that, that's been entered into since he took office, since before he took office. And the first of these was presented by Representative Al Green, Democrat from Texas, back the second day of Donald Trump's term. Second day, he introduced articles of impeachment, or at least an impeachment proposal. And they've been working very hard to get this done. And then, of course, it'd be amazing when you think about it to see what the Democrats who hate the president can do when they gain a few extra seats in the House. So there you go. That's what happens. I think the outcome of this is going to be, of course, in the Senate. The Senate will call it dead on arrival, and they'll vote it down. They'll shut it down is what they'll do. And for really partisan reasons, yeah. Oh, that's another thing, too. If you look at this impeachment is supposed to be non-partisan. And what do you have? You have only the Democrats who voted for it. And a couple of Democrats at that voted against it. So this is a completely partisan thing that's going on. And for all of Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, all of her declarations that this is a sad, solemn, prayerful occasion, it's anything but. If you notice, Jerry Nadler, who was head of the Judicial Committee, when he announced the other night that they were going to go into debate about the articles of impeachment, he went immediately that evening onto one of the late-night comedy shows. I think it was Seth Meyers? And it was cracking jokes about impeachment. And that's how solemn, sad, and prayerful it is to some of these people. So, there you go. I tend to wonder, this is a wonder I have, how many of the Democrats who voted for it that might have been either neutral on it or against it, I'd like to know what kind of pressure they got from the Democrat hierarchy behind the scenes. Wouldn't that be an interesting tale to tell? So, there it is. Donald Trump, the President of the United States, is the third president ever impeached while sitting in office by the House of Representatives, but he is also the first to be impeached along strict partisan party lines. And so we'll see where this goes. We'll see how it affects the 2020 election. All the trends right now are saying that the American people aren't really all for this. You've got your pockets, your loud, very publicly speaking pockets that are for it. So everybody tends to think, because the mainstream media is really an outlet for the Democratic Party, you have seen them producing stories out there that tend to make people think everybody's against Donald Trump, everybody wants him out of office. But that's just not so. The trend is against impeachment. The trend is against the Democrats doing what they're doing. So it'll be an interesting election. There's many that say that this will actually help Donald Trump get reelected. There's my thoughts on it. There's a whole lot more to say, but I don't want to get too political. That's just current events. So I'm not surprised he was impeached. We said all along, they've got the numbers in the House to do it since the last elections, the midterm elections last year. And so once they got enough seats in the House, November of last year, January of this year in earnest, when they all took their seats, that's when this whole process got kicked into high gear, because they knew they had the numbers no matter what the facts or the evidence said. And so Donald Trump is impeached. We weren't surprised about that. It'll be interesting. Right now, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, Democrat, is resisting. Resisting is not the word. She's stalling. She doesn't want the Democrats to push this over to the Senate, because the Senate has said it's going to be dead on arrival. So she is stalling that now. Doesn't go to the Senate until she says so. So they're just letting it stand as an impeachment. They said they want the Senate to be fair and impartial, which is something they have not been since the beginning. So it's very hypocritical at the same time. So I'm not too worried about it. I'm not worried about it at all. Politics is what politics is. I have my preferences. I have my opinions. I have my statements of fact out there. At the same time, it's going to be what it's going to be. I don't think he's going to be removed from office. I think that's a pipe dream. More of a pipe dream than actually impeaching him was. And he may just win re-election. So there you go, folks. That's put that in your pipes and smoke it. Tonight, I want to continue on with what we've been talking about with this show in general. And I'm going to get into something that has to do with faith development. You got to have faith, it says. I have very little faith. I have faith in things that I probably don't realize I have faith in. I have faith that there is a God out there. I have faith that there is a creator. Somebody that perhaps is as powerful enough to be sovereign over the universe as he was to create it. And I only use he. Pardon me, I'm not into all the personal pronoun things. He, because it's an easy way to refer to God. I could say she just as well. They, it. Whichever it is. They probably is more likely. So I have faith that a God exists, that a creator God exists. Is he a God that is intimately caring about the needs of humans and the sad state of affairs amongst humans? No, I don't think so, really. Maybe he intervenes on individuals' parts, maybe on corporate parts, but I basically see God as somebody that has made his creation and left it to go. And he's there in case there's any major disasters and stuff. Gone fishing, gone writing his memoirs, whatever it might be. Hate to sound so cynical, but that's become my view of God. So I have faith that a God exists, that a creator God exists out there. So I want to talk today about faith development. This is on top of all the psychological development, the character development, the spiral dynamics of development. This is now on top of all of that, adding to it. And we're building to something here, if you can't tell yet. We're getting somewhere with this. So faith development. If growth, like we saw on the spiral dynamics chart, if growth is an expansion into even larger capacities and perspectives, what does this mean in terms of faith and spirituality? There was a very noted social scientist, James Fowler, who provided an answer for this. In his studies, he interviewed several hundred Christians. And from those interviews, he came to observe a pattern of faith development that led him to identify several stages of faith. And we're going to examine those stages now, and we're going to take a look at them and how they apply to the levels of the spiral that we saw in Wilbur's developmental spaces. So let's look at the stages of faith. You ever thought of that? Are there stages of faith? Do you just believe something? What brought you to believe what you believe? Look at that spiral dynamic chart that we just went through, from the very basic all the way up to rising above it all. Let's call it stage 0. The first stage is the undifferentiated, or the primal stage, which is experienced in infancy. The self experiences faith as a trust relationship between itself and its caregivers, upon whom it's completely dependent. Look at an infant. An infant's completely dependent on its parents. Does an infant have faith, a cognitive awareness of its faith? No. It just has faith it's going to be fed, that someone's going to take care of it. The recognized mom's face and a touch is going to be there. That's on that primal level. And this stage is essentially equivalent to the archaic or the sensorimotor space. And it's that beige on that primal, or on that spiral dynamic chart. And once thought and language develop, the self transitions into now what would be, I think, the beyond the rudimentary stage of just undifferentiated or primal, and that's the intuitive projective stage, which emerges around age 2, lasts until about age 6 or 7. The self's principal ways of knowing the world are through our perceptions, our senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell, touch, all of those things. It lasts until about age 6 or 7. And the self's principal ways of knowing the world are through perceptions, feelings, imagination. The deep and long-lasting images are formed here, which are enriched by symbols and stories. Children are beginning to awaken to the world around them and to the mystery of possibly even death. And they combine pieces of stories to create an image of what they think God is. Now, this, of course, would be, I think, in situations or families where God is introduced. Does a 2 to 6-year-old imagine that there is a great God out there? I think there is some imagining of that. I don't know if it necessarily happens between 2 and 6, but this is where we as humans develop that capacity to understand or think or believe or perceive that there's something greater out there for us. And since the self can't separate fact and fantasy at this stage, frightening images can overwhelm it. It's noted that adults should be very careful with the images they offer to their children at this stage of their lives. There's an example. A child says, "My friend told me that the devil will come up out of a hole in the ground and get me if I'm not careful, so now I won't play in the backyard anymore." So this stage seems to correlate to the egocentric space and to that purple stage in the developmental spiral and the early red. And with the development of certain rational skills, the self begins to transition to the next stage. So a child starts to become, right now, my 5-year-old daughter, she just turned 5, absolutely afraid to go upstairs to her bedroom, or upstairs to mom and dad's bedroom, or upstairs for anything unless somebody goes with her. Even in the broad daylight where you have bright sunshine streaming in through the windows and everything's illuminated, she's afraid to go upstairs. Even though the fact there's a balcony that overlooks the downstairs. She can see us and hear us. We can't just stand down there and look up at her so she can go get something. Somebody's got to accompany her. So she has somewhere along the way developed the fear of being alone upstairs in her bedroom, just to go get a sweater or something like that, or get a toy. And maybe some of this is that, our older kids like to watch horror movies. They watch ghost shows. Now, my 8-year-old girl loves to watch ghost shows, like Ghost Adventures and things like that. But she only wants to watch them when it's daylight outside. When it gets dark outside, she doesn't want to watch those shows anymore. My son, my 10-year-old son, however, is really into this stuff, and he likes to come down in the middle of the night and watch those shows by himself in the living room. And he'll sometimes wake me up and ask if I can go watch a ghost show with him, which I won't do on a school night, generally on the weekends. So kids develop. So now this stage 2, let's move to that. The next stage of the faith cycle is the mythic literal, which usually emerges around age 6 or 7, and it continues to adolescence. This can include things like belief in Santa Claus, belief in the tooth fairy, but they start to wane as they get into this stage because they're starting to advance to the mythic literal stage now. So the self is less dependent on feelings and fantasies, and it can begin to actually reverse its thought processes. And so reasoning begins to develop, and the self demands this empirical proof. Empirical proof. I always say empirical, it's empirical proof, like empire. To separate fact from fantasy. So a child wants to start figuring things out. I remember my twin daughters, who are now pushing 28 next month. I remember when they were 5, on a Christmas morning, nobody was up yet, I could hear them in their bedroom chattering to each other. And the one of them said to the other, "Well, I don't know about this Santa thing. Did you notice that the wrapping paper Santa used last night is the same wrapping paper I saw in a couple of presents that Mom and Dad put under the tree?" Which was a mistake of Mom and Dad's. We didn't separate the papers out. But they were starting to figure it out even then. "Hey, I wonder about this Santa thing. I'll bet it's Mom and Dad." So both the world and the self's understanding of it become more orderly at this stage. And if the self follows this order, it's good. And it's going to be rewarded. But if it doesn't, it's bad. And it deserves punishment. That's the way it's perceived. So faith relationships are based on reciprocity. That the self will do what it's supposed to do, and God will do what he or she has agreed to do. So faith is also reliant on stories, particularly those of the family and the traditions. And knowing the stories of one's people, our people group, is an important part of the self-identification of this period for a child who is developing this ability to have faith. God images are fully anthropomorphic. They have human or animal characteristics. It doesn't matter which. And always they take the form that's promoted by the self's family, their culture, their religion. And the self's thinking is literal and concrete. People are defined by their roles and their affiliations, not on their individual personalities. So you should recognize that this fits into that blue level of the spiral. Maybe you can't call all that information up because this is basically an oral exercise, listening to radio. But that's that mythic phase that applies to this description. So now, that moves us on to the third stage. The self can enter the next stage, which is called the synthetic conventional. The synthetic conventional. As soon as it's able to reflect on its own thinking and ability, that usually emerges in adolescence. And so the self observes that moral reciprocity doesn't always occur. And so its concept of reciprocal faith from the prior stage begins to break down a bit. When teenagers realize they can get away with stuff, I was a teenager, you know what I'm talking about? When they realize they can start getting away with things and there isn't necessarily a moral reciprocity for their actions, that starts to break down their idea that faith has reciprocity. That if you don't believe this happens, if you do believe this happens. And so that breaks down. And in the earlier stages, the divine was rather impersonal. He was this great nebulous divine out there that got you if you were bad or rewarded you if you were good. and it's a keeper of order who rewarded and punished. But now, at this stage, the divine becomes deeply personal, and it knows the self intimately. And God at this stage resembles a divine, significant order to things. But there's a personality that's starting to emerge. Authority still originates from the outside, the self, and the self. From outside the self, and the self relies on others to define its faith relationships. That's when we start listening to the church. We start listening to those who are defining these things for us. And this stage is called conventional because the self derives its sense of identity and its faith from the values of others. It's synthetic, this synthetic conventional. It's synthetic because the self is now capable of pulling together differing elements to create its own stories and its own sense of identity. That's why it's synthetic. It's man-made. We start to put things together in our own minds. Excuse me. Yet, this synthesis that we're creating is largely tacit. It's unexamined. While we can pull stories together in a system, the self isn't able to reflect critically on those stories themselves. For this reason, the edges of self's belief system is surrounded by absolute mystery. We start to synthesize things, but at the same time, there's a mystery behind it that we don't quite grasp. So asking too many questions is uncomfortable. That's like when I asked my youth group the question, why do you believe what you believe? Why are you a Christian? I asked them. Tell me. Anybody here in the group, I said, tell me why you're a Christian. Why are you here at church listening to me? Why are you part of this youth group? Why are you here? Many of them, oh, my parents make me come. Oh, it's what we've always done. Blah, blah, blah. All those answers. So there are things the self can't really explain and doesn't particularly want to. They don't really want to go into that at that stage. So the self then is still embedded in its own story. The stories of its faith, the stories it creates for itself. Symbols of the sacred are confused with the sacred. It's like a crucifix on a necklace. That's not sacred. It's a piece of plastic or metal or wood or whatever it might be. It in and of itself is not sacred. But at this stage, the sacred is confused. Symbols of the sacred are confused with the sacred. And any attempt to separate the two is seen as an attack on the divine itself. And so many people are currently still at this stage. Many people in the world are stuck at that stage. And many will never, ever leave it or abandon that. If an individual stops his or her faith development, he or she will move through life with a set of tacitly held, strongly felt, but largely unexamined beliefs and values. And so the transition to the next stage can be triggered by the individual leaving home, by finding the self at odds with authority, by observing conflicts between authorities. And we'll get to that stage after 2 minutes because we're at the end of the first segment. Sit tight. We'll be right back.
In a place where no one goes, he tears at himself, lives with a pain that no one knows. He counts himself dead among the living. He knows no mercy and no forgiving. Deep in the night, driven to cry out loud. Can you hear him cry out loud? Man of the tombs, possessed by an unseen enemy, breaks every chain Like those I've heard, I can feel pain. Naked now before my sin. These stones that cut against my skin. Some try to touch me, but no one can. Man of the tombs I am. Down at the shoreline, two sets of footprints meet. One voice is screaming, other voice begins to speak. In only a moment and only a word, the evil departs like a thundering herd. Man of the tombs, he hears this cry out loud. Underneath this thing that you've become, I see man, flesh and blood. I give you life beyond the grave. I heal your heart, I come to save. No need to fear, be not afraid. This man of sorrows knows your pain. I come to take away your sin and bear its marks upon my skin. When no one can touch you, still I can. For Son of God I am. Now and seated, clean in spirit and healthy of mind, man of the tombs, he begs to follow but must stay behind. He'll return to his family with stories to tell of mercy and madness, of heaven and hell. Of the tombs, soon he will cry out loud. Underneath this thing that I once was, now I'm a man of flesh and blood. I have a life beyond the grave. I found my heart, I can now be saved. No need to fear, I am not afraid. This man of sorrows took my pain. He comes to take away our sin and bear its marks upon his skin. I'm telling you this story because man of the tombs I was. Man of the tombs I was.
Hey folks, thanks for sitting through that break. Thanks for coming back. We're going to get right back into this really exciting stuff about understanding faith development. You got to have faith. But why? What does faith do? Where does it come from? That's what we're looking at. How does it develop in an individual? And of course, I'm Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can come over and join the live YouTube stream that is simulcast alongside of this broadcast. And you can join the Intrepids over in the chat room, talk about this show, talk about other things that you want. Now you can hear a screaming child in the background here, maybe. That's because my studio is not soundproofed, and my small child, who thinks she is the center of the universe at age 5, is trying to assert her authority out there. So keeping her out of here when she does that is, while I'm doing a show, is very interesting. So anyway, YouTube, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts to join the simulcast. And you can listen to the audio on Odyssey Radio, and you can watch the video and join the chat room right here. So thank you all for being here. Thanks for being here, sitting through the break and all of that. Well, let's jump right back into it. We were just talking about this whole synthetic, the synthetic construction of our faith at this certain stage. It's more kind of an adolescent stage. The synthetic, the conventional, the things that we construct based on what we believe. But we start to create our own stories. And many people are stuck right there for the rest of their lives at that stage, which is an adolescent stage of faith. It's not a developed stage of faith. And that's where they look at the sacred symbols as being as important as the sacred. What they are told is what is so. But even though their mind might start creating their own stories to develop their faith. And so the transition can be triggered by an adolescent who grows a little older and leaves home, finding the self at odds with authority, or observing these conflicts between the authorities within that faith structure. And the fourth stage is the individuative reflective. Got that? The individuative reflective. And it can emerge when the self's reliance on external authority is disrupted. And if the self is willing to take responsibility for its own choices at that point. This is where you get the individuative reflective. And so what was previously tacit and unexamined now becomes explicit. The self is able to choose its own values and its own commitments to what it wants to believe. The best time for this emergence is during a person's 20s. And if it happens later, the transition will more than likely take a little longer, cause a little more disruption to the self's network of roles and relations, because we get set in our ways. Our 20s are wild and weird and crazy, especially in modern culture. And I've mentioned this before. Remember Napoleon Bonaparte? He became the general of all of France's armies at age 23 on his way to becoming the self-appointed emperor. And he crowned himself because nobody was good enough to crown him. But he was only 23 when he did that. You look at, maybe that was with the short lifespans of humans. Now the lifespans have expanded. We've got the kind of culture and traditions we do in our society. Of course, we see kids being kids longer and into the 20s. I always said 18 years old isn't the end of childhood. 30 years old is the end of childhood. I remember when I turned 30, and that was almost 30 years ago. I said, that's it. 30 is now, I'm transitioning from 29 and having the mind of a child to being 30, and I'm now going to be an adult. That's the transition, as I put it back then. So the process of individuation isn't really an easy process to enter. The self is really overly busy questioning itself, reflecting critically, and it begins to detach itself from certain symbols. That is, it begins to realize that symbols and representations and stories about something aren't always the thing that they represent. And this is about the same concept discussed when we looked at the ideas about God, turning ideas about God into God. And the self is able to make this separation now, and it deals with beliefs and more objectivity. This process is the demythologizing, if you will, if that's even a word. The demythologizing. It brings both gains and losses. On the one side, the losses, the self's reliance upon, and the trust it had in the truth is forever interrupted. I went through this. Some of you have gone through this already. Me, maybe later than normal, because I was so immersed in my faith story and in what I saw as being the real faith. And it didn't hit me till I started getting into my 30s. And then that was a long process of dissecting things and filtering things out. So on the side of the loss, the self's reliance on the symbols, the trust, all of that stuff is forever interrupted. For those who've enjoyed an unquestioning relation to the transcendent and to their fellow worshipers through a set of religious symbols, unmythologizing your life can bring a dislocation, a grief, even guilt. And you know what? When I did this, when I was going through this demythologization, the demythologizing of my life, I went through a grief process. I went through a guilt process. Oh my God, I can't think this way. This is anti-God. This is anti what I believed. And then when the realization came that you're on the right path, there was the grief associated with it. You know, this is what I believed for so long. How can it not be true? How is it that I'm finding it isn't true, or it's different, that it's broken? And, even when you've seen me here on this show, when I recite certain song lyrics, they can break me down a little bit emotionally because there is still that tendril of grief of overcoming the thing that you believed once was and might be something very different than what you believed. And so symbols are broken open. The things that were accepted tacitly and responded to without even thinking about them, without reflecting on them or examining them, are now identified and conceptualized. And those symbols are all broken up. Their inner meaning can be removed and communicated with directly. And weighing and comparing this variety of meanings is now possible at this stage. And the inner capacity of the individual is expanded. You might recognize the rational space that we talked about just a couple of days ago, and the beginnings of that orange stage on that dynamic spiral, where we really start to separate ourselves out. And so I know in the church I was in, the religion I was in, the denomination, excuse me, I'm not drinking too much during this show, that would prompt calls of, Scotty, you're backsliding. You've got to get right with the Lord. Make your heart right with Jesus. Get down on your knees and pray and ask Jesus to forgive you because you're backsliding. You're slipping out of the faith. And there were times I did that. I went, yeah, you are right. I'm backsliding. And I've got to make this right with God. And then I'd go right back into the faith. But then those questions would rise again. So this all leads us to the next stage. It's the conjunctive stage. It's usually experienced in midlife. Your midlife crisis, that can start anywhere from the time you're 35 until you're 50. Somewhere in there, the midlife, if it's even reached. And in this stage, the self goes beyond the rational constructs that it created in the prior stage. It begins to let reality speak with its own voice, regardless of the impact that voice has on the self's worldview or sense of security. The self can see both sides of an issue simultaneously and accepts that truth. It's more multidimensional and organically interdependent than most theories or accounts of truth can grasp. So religiously, it knows that the symbols and the stories and the doctrines and the liturgies offered by its own or other traditions are inevitably partial. They're limited to a particular people's experience of God. And it's it's wholly incomplete, and that's the problem with it. So the self appreciates its own and other symbols because it understands the greater wisdom they reflect. You get that? We start to see that there is wisdom elsewhere. How can these people all be so wrong theologically and have so much wisdom at the same time? That's the way we start to see things. The self appreciates its own and other symbols because of this. And it's ready to have encounters with other belief systems. In the prior stage, the self identified itself with its conscious awareness. Now the self incorporates the subconscious and the unconscious as well. And it's noted that commitment to justice is freed from the confines of tribe, class, religious community, or nation. And the system, this stage, really starts to correlate with the vision logic spaces that were on the spiral dynamics chart, and their skills in appreciating multiple perspectives. The green level of the spiral also seemed related to conjunctive faith, with its concerns for justice across all lines of creed or ethnicity, and its global views, its non-dogmatic interest in spirituality, and its ability to be at ease with multiple perspectives. I know I started this in my early 30s, where I was looking at paganism for the first time. Not to incorporate it, but to understand it and to see where they were coming from. And all of this, by the way, leads now to the sixth stage, which is universalizing. At this stage, the self makes the divine real in its person. And the person becomes a discipled activist, incarnation, a making real and tangible of the imperatives of absolute love and justice. So individuals in this stage usually detach from their local communities. They leave their church. They come to identify with a community that's universal in scope. And they challenge unjust social, political, and religious structures. And they do so without regard for their own safety. They may indeed be considered subversive by the general culture, but this doesn't mean that these people are perfect or always easy to get along with. And it's noted that some do tend to become overly detached and overly isolated. You've got to be very careful of that. I know people, say, in the political realm, friends of people that are friends of mine. There's a family of friends of mine that have declared, I am a Nazi and I am a hater and I am all of these things because they are so sunk into their own developed worldview that they become attached or detached and absolutely isolated from reality within their own view of the world. That's a very bad place to be. And however, they're generally comfortable with people in any developmental space. And from any religion, this guy, no, he's comfortable with people. You get him into a political debate, it's different. And so examples are of people who are like this, who've reached this stage, include people like Gandhi, like Martin Luther King Jr., Mother Teresa, amongst others. Now, of course, we all know those three I just mentioned, they had their faults and their problems too. So this isn't saying that you reach any kind of stage of perfection. It's saying you've reached a place where you have accepted the fact that you can be a little detached and a little isolated in your belief system. And so this all fits on top of all of that that spiral dynamics development stage in personality. That's the spiritual. Now, sociologist, Nicholas Lee, who studies faith development in women, generally agrees with this model, but believes he overemphasizes the development of analytical thinking and detachment on the higher levels of spiritual development. Now, Nicola Slee notes that women at more advanced levels of faith and faith development continue to emphasize intuitive knowledge, imagination, concrete forms of thinking and metaphor, for which Fowler in his charts rates them a lot lower. And so women emphasize relational forms of faith over those that are more abstract and impersonal. Now, this gets to the difference between male and female. Men tend to think abstractly. Women tend to think creatively. They tend to think relationally. And this is a generalization of physiology that brings this about. I had to look for the word for a second there. Women emphasize these relational forms of faith over the more abstract and impersonal. Fowler tends to equate growth and separation from the demands of relationship. Slee observes that women she interviewed stayed conscious of relational faith throughout every stage. And so as they advance, women become more moved toward a consciously owned faith. Not by distancing themselves from relationship and commitments, but precisely in and through those relational ties. Men tend to do the opposite. We have a concept out there, and we go with that abstract concept, and this is the way. And women are like, oh, I want to feel that. And so maybe there's this correlation between the universalizing stage and second-tier thinking like is on the spiral. The self breaks free of its attachment to any of the lower levels of the spiral and can see them all simultaneously, experience them all simultaneously. And with that perspective, the self can readily see the issues and the blind spots as well as the strengths of the various levels. It also has this unusual ability, at least according to the first-tier perspective, to travel the levels of the spiral at will and be able to interact with all the levels in the way that they can understand. The second tier itself, of self, is concerned with the overall health of the spiral, not just that of the singular level that they might be in, and or of one group or one country or one set of political corporate rules and regulations or religious concerns. If these universalizers represent the second tier, thinking within a religious context, people are going to be rare and misunderstood a lot more often. At the edge of their horizon is significantly larger than that of their contemporaries. So the more you look outward, the edge of your horizon becomes much larger to you than others around you who don't want to think that way, who get dragged kicking and screaming into that. And so I want to ask you a few questions that you should consider. Do you recognize any of the stages of faith as places that you have visited in your spiritual journey? If so, which ones? What was your spirituality like in those stages? What stage do you believe you're in now? Are you the pre-infant? Are you the infant to toddler? Are you the toddler to adolescent? Are you the adolescent who starts to question things and question the morality, reciprocities? Are you in your 20s? Are you middle-aged? Have you gotten to a place, where do you feel you are in your spiritual journey? What was your spirituality like when you were in those stages? Do you recognize it? Can you look back and recognize? Are you fully cognizant of that right now? What stage do you believe you're in right now? Where are you? Which stage would you like to be in? And why? And there's no harm in saying, I guess I haven't reached that particular stage yet. There's nothing wrong with learning along the way. This is how we develop and get there. Would your life change if you were in a different stage? Or what would be the more advanced, the next step up? If so, how would your life change? How would your belief system change? Which ones would change, and how would they change for you? Have you ever had a symbol, a practice, a belief, a story, a mythology lose its meaning for you? No longer works for you. What happened? How did you feel while going through that experience? Disillusionment? Detachment? Grief? How do you feel about it now when you reflect on it? Or now, if you're starting to realize, this is maybe where I am, how did your spirituality change because of it? So you got to start asking yourself those questions. Dig a little deep and see where you are. And those different stages of faith development, you've got to see where you're plugged in there. Are you stuck on the one that most are stuck on? Where the symbols of the sacred become the sacred. Where the stories become the literal. This is so, and this is the way it is. Instead of advancing beyond that and seeing things through multiple eyes. Multiple perceptions. So, there we are. And we've got only a few minutes left in this program, about 3.5 minutes. What I wanted to get into next, which maybe I'll just introduce now, is relationships with myth. What are our relationships with our mythology? The relationship that people have with myth or story often changes over time. You're going to recall that what's described as myth is a narrative structure of meaning. And the structure of meaning can be personal. Now, by the way, by mythology, I'm not talking necessarily about, and the horned gods descended on the country, and there's a great war between the elves and the, whatever. That's not what I'm talking about with mythology. Mythology is that whole structured set of beliefs that are kind of the basis stories of the foundational stories of what we believe. So this structure of meaning can be personal to an individual or shared among members of a group. But the self will give meaning to its experiences through the use of a story about itself and its world. And in regard to spirituality, the issue is not whether the self has a story concerning its spiritual identity, despite all the things we've looked at, but what the nature of its relationship in the story is. Myth is a tool that humans have created for their own use, but it's also a tool that helps create the self and its culture. And so, in other words, the self, ourselves, us, me, mine, inside, my faith, my spirituality, uses myth both to give meaning to our worlds and also to explain the meaning it's already giving to the world. So the mythologies we believe in our chosen faiths, our chosen spiritualities, these are things that we give life to because we choose to believe them and we choose to operate within those structures that we've set up. And the question is, when do you start reaching a place where you're finding your mythology is the story that you've used as the buoyancy to your hot air balloon of faith? Let the hot air out of it. Let the hot air out of your faith structure. And what are you going to have left? And find out where you are. Find out how much your myths are things that you have relied on to create the literal history of who you are and what your belief structure is. If the self's moral span expands from caring only about itself to caring about all creatures, then how does this process impact the story it adopts and how the world works? How does the self interact with or adapt its own story about what's worthy of its moral regard? And there's lots of questions like that we can ask. And we'll keep asking. But for now, guess what? We're at the end of the show. This is the end of tonight's program. And I hope you drew something out of it that is meaningful for you. Where are you in your faith development, your faith and spirituality development? Ask yourself these tough questions. And we'll be back after this 23-hour break. Sit tight. Don't go away. Love you all.